today I'm excited to have Raghunathan here with us today. Always fun with the more complicated names for me, but Abhi, pleasure to have you here and appreciate your time. So on your side, the reason we have Abhi here is he is actually the founder of the Ethical AI Database, along with his day job as a data scientist at Vanguard. And the ethical AI database hit our radar because it's really one of the interesting areas where someone is trying to come together and provide transparency into the developing areas of AI and the vendors and partners who are trying to influence it, such as ourselves at AI Guardian. What was really interesting to me, Abhi, was how you described ethical AI database. In particular, it's providing the differentiation between companies that solve problems with AI and companies that solve the problems of AI. And I'm curious, can you talk about that a little bit from your perspective and kind of what was the impetus and how you define that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, AI is not new, ML is not new. There's been years and years of a track record in which ML has caused real damage. And,
Yeah.
that's only carrying over into the current day and age with AI and all these more powerful technologies. And so the thought behind it was kind of like, you can't really drive a car unless you know that there are brakes so that,
Yeah.
you can't accelerate. It's kind of like you can't accelerate AI unless you know that there's some kind of guardrail, right? There has to be some brakes on the system so that you know that everything isn't going to just melt and collapse. And I think that that system was not very focused on when AI and all this, generative AI stuff came out, very recently. And I think that especially now, given that the stakes are a lot higher, that there's even more uncontrollable technology that interacts with society on a near daily basis.
Mhm.
It's scary, and part of the effort with the ethical AI database was to categorize and research the companies that were actively trying to constrain the sort of rampant effects of AI and ML as we know it. And so the effort started out really small. The space itself is still new, and everything is very these are early days still, but when we started, there were only around 100 companies that were actively in the space. Um, and since then, it's almost, we're currently tracking close to 300 companies that are all trying to enable more responsible, more transparent and safe AI. And I think that's a testament to how much it's needed in the current day and age. And it's a testament to how difficult the problem really is. So,
No, that actually makes a ton of sense. And yeah, I remember yeah, I've been around SaaS a long time, and I remember there's a company out there called Luma, and they do these Lumascapes, and it would start in a SaaS place with like 10 companies, and then it
yeah,
goes to 100, and then eventually you just get to this map that looks like a whole bunch of a galaxy of stars
yeah.
of everything there. And I assume, yeah, we'll get the same place with with AI governance and other areas as well. So yeah, that helps me a lot on your side. And it's interesting you mentioned the car example of kind of like without brakes. Like we've used that example a little bit too of like
Yeah.
this amazing invention of the automobile. But yeah, early on, no faulty brakes, no seat belts, no safety devices, and you had a lot of accidents along the way.
Yeah.
I'm curious, as someone who's kind of worked a little in these spaces, what are you most worried about as it relates to AI nowadays? What do you are just most concerned as you see it kind of coming out of the gate here?
Yeah. I think this is one that I probably share with a lot of other people as well. But I think the most dangerous thing is applying generative AI and all of these really complex technologies for problems that don't require them. And I think
No.
I think the most simple example was there was a dealership recently that announced that they're going to start selling cars through a chat GPT enabled interface. And people found out how to get the chat interface to sell them cars for $1. Just by prompt attacking and things like that. And the question is, did you really need ChatGPT to sell people cars? Isn't that is that really a proper use case for that technology? And I think in general, I talk to a lot of consulting firms that work on the same problem, advising companies on how to use generative AI, and their biggest fears are the same. We still aren't sure, or companies are still not sure what appropriate use cases are for generative AI. And I think that that's a very scary thing because if you don't know what it's supposed to be used for, you tend to think, let me use it for everything I can. It's like a
Right.
fear of missing out problem too.
Yeah.
And then you kind of get a lot of chaos along the way. And I feel like um, given the pace of technological innovation in that space too, when you start throwing things at a problem, especially generative AI, things can cascade very quickly.
Yeah.
Um, and so, that's kind of my biggest nightmare. And it's already happened a little bit. So, hoping it doesn't continue the way it is currently.
Yeah, so you don't think the fast food companies doing pilots of ChatGPT in the drive-through window are the right exercise
Oh
for
man. No, I think that's a really interesting use case from a research perspective. I would never think that that would work in practice, but
that?
hopefully they use one of the vendors in the ethical AI database to sort of hold their system together.
So you just mentioned kind of the pace of generative AI. I'm kind of curious on your side, what do you anticipate as the pace of generative AI when you think about kind of how generative AI is a part of our lives, say by the end of this year, as we enter the 2024? Where do you think this is headed and the pace by which it's going to be there?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about the generative AI hype cycle, we're at a point now where the technology is still advancing very rapidly, but all of the innovation is on the extremely technical side. So we won't see something like ChatGPT, the same, a different version of ChatGPT coming out and completely blowing everyone away. I think it's everything that comes out this year is going to be a more nuanced version of that. I think people are going to have to level set their expectation on generative AI this year. I think companies are already coming to that realization, right? I think people are just figuring out that it's a lot harder to, actually build these systems properly than it seemed at first. You can't just connect to OpenAI and solve all your problems, right? It's not like that. Um,
Well,
so I
I
think a
think
lot.
you just killed half the business plans of Y Combinator there. That's fine.
No, I mean, I honestly do think. I mean, so I build generative AI for Vanguard, and that's just completely separate from the database itself. But during my day job, I'm a practical, applied person, a student of generative AI. And then when it's nighttime, I come back and look at everything holistically, and I'm like, there's no way that this should be used the way it is.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting place to be. But I do think that companies in general, and it's not just I'm not speaking for Vanguard or anything, per completely personal opinion, but I think companies are kind of realizing it takes a lot of effort and a lot of people. It takes a whole village to
Yeah.
raise generative AI within an organization.
Right. That makes perfect sense. So let me ask you on the ethical side. So, obviously creating a landscape of companies through the ethical AI database kind of helps facilitate the adoption of AI ethically. But when you talk to organizations, I'm just kind of curious, how are you seeing them approach and prioritize the ethical component of AI at this stage? Are they taking it seriously yet? Are they thinking about it? As you kind of go out with this landscape, what are your conversations like on this subject?
Yeah, I think, well, for the most part, it kind of depends on where you are geographically. You'll notice that in Europe, the prioritization of doing things a little properly is definitely up there. There's a lot of we've seen this, right? Policy, technically, typically, EU is always a leader in policy and legislation and regulation. US tends to be more profit focused, and being responsible. It's not the easiest thing to demonstrate that being responsible is profitable.
Yeah.
But in Europe, a lot of the focus is on how do we build these systems properly. You think about the Nordics and the Nordic culture.
Yeah.
Um, the whole Nordic system is about society, and in that regard, they treat this very seriously. But our organizations in the U.S., there's a lot of moving legislation that's coming, and I think that's going to be the incentive that pushes corporations to sort of start caring about it. Um, there's no intrinsic motivation in the U.S., but there will be extrinsic motivation. I think that's going to be the turning point.
Yeah.
In Europe, there's a little bit more of a balance. And what's interesting is a lot of developing markets like Australia and Asia, they're sort of building in tandem with being responsible because they've seen what building without being responsible can do.
Right.
And so they're kind of treating these things with seriousness. So I think it's a mix, and it kind of depends on where the corporation really sits.
Yeah, and it's an interesting dichotomy for me looking at the space because you've got Europe coming out of the gate strong. Obviously, certain states in the US like California will do well, get ahead like they have in data privacy.
Mhm.
Um, but it's interesting, every one of these pieces of legislation is focused on what do we see as the harm, societal harms, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
But every one of them carves out government and military use from its regulation. And I don't know if that's just because they know they can't actually regulate it or not, but there's a distinct fear of a company going sideways and creating Skynet. And then there's a distinct fear of every government in the world trying this as well at the same time. And even OpenAI this last week pulled back their language around banning military or government
Oh,
use.
did they?
It's
Oh
interesting.
man,
Yeah. Yeah, they adjusted their terms of service to pull some of that language out.
interesting.
So I'm curious on your side. So why do you think ethical and responsible AI adoption is critical for most organizations right now? They're obviously running forward as fast as they can, but
Mhm.
if you're going in front of them and you're saying, "Hey, here's the real benefits of it. I know you want to run fast. I want to know you want to go and break things the Silicon Valley way." But when you talk to them or think about it, what are the benefits as they adopt AI that you think are important here?
Yeah, I think it comes down to like customer trust and literally just trust. And I think no business can ever operate without trust from consumers. And I think when you run any kind of generative AI application, you run the risk of something can happen that makes my customers lose trust in my product. And I think even if you're internal, even if you're at a massive institution, a massive enterprise, and you're trying to sell a product to even internal teams, you have to demonstrate that there's a reason to trust the product, right? And I think that if you use generative AI, there's a very high likelihood that you can't trust the output, right? So if you just plug and chug with ChatGPT, there's a hallucination rate there. It's marginal, but it's still there. And the question is, how do we know? How can we tell?
Yeah.
And the whole system of trust around generative AI has not been built, and there's very little work being done on the big sort of AI providers on that trustworthiness aspect. That's not a part that is really profitable to them, and so they don't do it.
Yeah.
Um, so it's on. You'll see that a lot of companies in the ethical AI database have added product mixes or pivoted slightly to compensate for generative AI applications, right? So they have now added additional capabilities to provide that trust to the Gen AI pipeline because it doesn't exist currently. Um, so that's why I think it's important. I mean, the if you can't trust the product, if you can't trust the output, then what's the point of the product, right? It's going to die if you try to sell it internally. And so, that's just the biggest thing from a profit perspective. In general, you should try to be responsible regardless, because it's just the right thing to do. But that's intrinsic motivation. We've talked about that already.
Yeah. No, I love that answer of trust because I agree with you 100%. Um, and when I think trust, it's interesting for me for trust because I've been through a few of these cycles in tech, but one of the oldest ones is nuclear power, right? You had, I think,
Mhm.
a perfect parallel there on trust is nuclear power in the U.S. You had, an event with 3 Mile Island
Yeah.
that scared the country back
Mhm.
in the 70s. And any logical way of looking at nuclear power, it's one of the safest, cleanest energy sources
Yep.
you employ. And you've seen countries like France employ it for almost 100% of its grid. But
Yep.
we don't do it in the US because as a country, we got scared of it and walked away from it. And my biggest fear of AI adoption is that not that we move fast enough, but we move too fast and don't think about what happens if there's a 3 Mile Island and
Mhm.
event in our space, a Black Swan event that scares a nation away from it.
Yeah.
And I think trust comes down to it. You've got this reservoir of trust that can get eroded really quickly. And the calls for, I think there's really responsible regulation out there, but there could be really stuff that shuts it down. And because our country or our world gets scared by it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm curious from your perspective, how do you think about AI governance or responsible AI? How do you define it? I'm kind of curious on your side how you think about this as it applies to ethical use cases.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess it is very hard to define what AI governance really is because there's tons of different stages to what
Yeah.
that whole pipeline has governance attached to it in various sort of locations. So, for example, there's data governance, there's model governance, there's
Yeah.
general governance after implementation. There's the whole spectrum of companies there. But the way I define it is kind of it goes back to that break system. If there's a way to place trust, a way to place checks and balances at any point during the pipeline, that's some sort of management, some sort of governance, right? And so you'll see companies now, just from speaking from the ethical AI database perspective, you'll see companies that try to govern your data. What data goes into a model, how safe is that data, how much PII is in that data, can we redact it, can we treat it differently, all that stuff. And also, where are the touch points of your data across your organization? How much of that is dangerous and sensitive data? Then you
Yeah.
get to the model governance, and models can be very tricky and can oftentimes be biased and can make bad decisions. So the model governance piece is, given this model, how do I make sure that this is a safe system? How do I make sure it's making the right decisions? Is it trustworthy? Is it safe? All of that stuff. And then there's this sort of implementation piece that ties everything together. Given my data position, given my model, how compliant am I? How safe am I on a very holistic basis across an enterprise? So all of this is just about how do we make sure that there are breaks, right? How do we make sure that there were breaks set up at every point of the pipeline? And
Yeah.
that to me is governance, right? That to me is knowing where exactly the breaks are across your enterprise, and knowing that they're there is the important part.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, and I loved yesterday the World Economic Forum AI Governance Committee came out with like some good frameworks. And embedded in it, they had the bless you, the shift left mentality. Like take everything you should be doing on governance and shift it left one. Get in earlier in the model journey with the things you think you should be doing. And I think that absolutely strikes a key right now.
Yeah, I
Um,
like that phrase.
yeah. So I'm curious on your side then, when you think about AI governance efforts around that, like I think so many companies are struggling with what to do now, how to get started on it. What do you think companies should be implementing now in this regard? Like, should they be focusing at the model level, the operational level, both? And specifics, what can they, if you have to tell them like, hey, at least do these three things,
Mhm.
what do you think they should be doing at this point?
I mean, I think at this stage, really, it comes down to one thing, and that's just sort of build your organizational policy for what you define as safe and what you define as trustworthy, and don't make it sort of like an echo chamber within your own organization. Bring in people from outside, diverse perspectives, figure out what it is for your company to be safe and trustworthy, and determining how that's done is a different process. But I
Yeah,
think it's important to figure out how exactly you want your organization to position itself, and what are the things that are necessary to make sure that you instill trust in your consumers.
yeah,
And I think that itself is a very challenging task, because you know, that requires commitment first and foremost.
yeah,
And so that's what I'd say. I mean, in response to the EU AI Act, that's what people are doing in Europe now, right? Corporations are looking at the act as incentive to say, okay, here are the things, here's what we need to do. We need to start forming a whole
hmm,
framework around how our organization is going to operate. And I'm not an expert in frameworks or anything like that, but I think at the base level, if you're an organization that uses AI on a wide scale, you have to know you have to know what you want to do in order to make that first step towards implementing solutions that solve your governance problems and all of that stuff. Um, yeah, that's what I would say.
yeah. And I did like what you said earlier too about the use cases. Like at a certain level, you have to determine what's use case worthy or not, right? What are the
Yeah,
things we should be applying
especially.
it to or not at this stage, given the inherent complexities and honestly dangers that it amplifies certain issues quickly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think sorry, one more point there. When you come up with a framework, the way you actually, a lot of these AI governance tools, they give you a way to, given your framework, we can tell you how to comply with your own framework and with the larger regulatory scale. If you don't have that internal framework, there's nothing to really automate that compliance for. You can't do GRC if you don't know what your internal policy is going to be around GRC. So that's the last thing I wanted to mention. I think it's one of the prerequisites to doing GRC properly.
well, yeah, and it's funny how many companies we talk to, we do say, hey, here's five things you should do, and policies are one of those.
Yeah.
And it's funny how many of them, when we talk to partners, their only policy is a thou shall not policy right now. Like, don't do that's all they've got. And so
Yeah.
other business leaders are coming to the risk management groups and going, all right, but I've got hell, forget models. I just have a third party vendor that's now got AI in it. Are we allowed to turn that on? And there's no path to yes yet. It's a whole bunch of paths to no because they don't know how to get to yes because they don't have a policy that's really defined
Right.
along as you talked, which is interesting. Okay. So I'm curious, we've mentioned the EUA Act and some other things, but do you have a viewpoint on what role legal and regulatory bodies should be playing in AI at this point? Do you have a perspective on that there?
Yeah. In my opinion, I think it's going to take a long time for regulatory agencies to ramp up onto this space. It's a very abstract technology, and I think really understanding how it works is a big part of that. I don't expect any, big stepping in at this point on most regulatory authorities. I was very surprised at the pace of the EU AI Act. I think it was, I don't think the US is going to be quite as fast to do something similar because they require you got to scale up on that knowledge first, and I think that's a difficult task. I do think legal is starting to get more and more involved. We saw that New York Times lawsuit, that's still ongoing, and there's a lot of other lawsuits around IP and things like that, and copyrights, and that whole battle is still being fought. A lot of the more successful companies in EAIDB, at least in the governance aspect, do have some kind of legal background as well. So I think about Enzai Technologies out of Ireland. I think of there's a couple of others that have sort of a legal background, and that helps in a lot of ways, right? Because companies at the end of the day, they want to know how to be compliant and avoid lawsuits. And I
Yeah.
think that second part is a very incentivizing notion for a lot of companies. So
Here's my
um,
question on that. Like, how did they avoid lawsuits? Like, that's the thing we struggle with. Like, I think the regulatory
yeah,
is here, but eh,
yeah,
all the case law is gray area, and it's not going to be settled for years.
right.
How do you navigate that right now?
It's a good question. I wish I had an answer. That would be
Yeah.
that's the $1 million question, isn't it? But I think probably someone with a legal background might be able to answer that one.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, right? Like the law is a gray area, but it's knowing how to defend yourself, and sort of knowing, um, given these things that I've tried to do, if you can demonstrate that you actively tried to mitigate,
Yeah.
the disasters that they're mentioning in the lawsuit, then maybe you have a case, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I just feel like having a diverse set of perspectives when you do GRC, when you do, build an organization using AI, legal should be one of those concerns, because that's one of the larger regulatory bodies, if you will, that almost plays a part in the whole thing.
No, and I think you're 100% right on the defensibility piece. I mean, case law in the U.S. has historically been deferential when they know there's not established case law, but
Yeah,
they always look and go, did you at least try, right? Did you
yeah,
try to do the right thing as you went along, even though the legal system hadn't caught up to this new innovation? And
mhm,
if you can do that through AI governance, you can show that you did these policies, you laid out approvals properly, you did testing as you should. Even if Getty comes and sues you for IP issues, right? Or music artist does, you can say I was trying to act responsibly in an environment where the rules weren't set.
yeah,
That gives you a lot of leeway sometimes early in that process.
agreed. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's interesting you say on like the U.S. I'm divided on the U.S. at this point. I
right.
think at a federal level, you're probably not going to see a lot, especially with an election coming. I think
Yeah,
Biden's doing what he can through executive order. But I do think you're going to see states rise up, particularly California, and push, just like they did with CCPA or hell, I think EPA is a great example out of California, right?
mhm,
Where they dictated car emission standards, right?
yeah,
Back in the 60s and 70s, and they were like, we don't know what the hell we don't know combustion engines. We don't know how to get there, but we're just
yeah,
going to say it has to be X by X date and then let the
mhm,
car companies figure it out. I wouldn't be surprised if you have some of those things here where it's like, I don't know how to figure out transparency for a LLM or a
mhm.
ChatGPT there, but we're going to throw down that gauntlet and make them conform to it.
Yeah, I think it's funny you mentioned that. I think it's a lot easier to give you a quantitative measurement of what safe is if you're the EPA for cars, because there's an emission, there's an amount of emission that's measurable. How do you measure transparency for a large language model, right? I think it's a really tricky problem. But maybe if there's a way to quantify sort of maybe money spent on
Yeah.
mitigate, but it doesn't seem like a good way of doing things.
Oh yeah, I don't know when it comes to regulation. I don't know if there's ever going to be a good, perfect way, but you can see some big hammers coming in some
Yeah,
regard.
yeah, I agree.
Uh, so I'm curious, what's your forecast for the year ahead on AI adoption and ethical practices? Do you see really fast year, one with bumps in the road, hell, a black swan event coming? When you think about this, where do you see the year ahead on things?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's still scrambling to adopt AI. That's always going to be the case. I think now this year might be one where I think we are going to see a couple black swans, and I say that because you can't have the pace at which we're going. That cannot be sustained for forever without something breaking, right? And I think something eventually will break, and we've already seen little tiny breaks in AI. Not with generative AI quite yet, but you kind of feel like it's coming. It's only going to take one big company to slip up, and then all of a sudden it's going to be a huge fiasco. And Google, Facebook, they haven't had the best track records with these kind of things. You know, when they started using ML, there was a whole, you know, tons and tons of examples of how their systems broke on a regular basis. And so, but because everything wasn't under the microscope at that time, they kind of got away with a lot of things. And I think that's not going to be the case with generative AI. So I think this year, everyone's trying to scale up on AI and Gen AI because of the whole fear of missing out idea. But I think there will be a point at which something bad happens, unfortunately, you know, and I think it's going to take that to really turn the tables on how organizations look at how they're governing their own software and their systems. That's what I think. I mean, if you look at things like the AI incident database, you'll see that the number of incidents increased. Forgot the number, but pretty significantly from last year to this year. There's been more cases of AI breaking. There's been more cases of just traditional ML breaking as well. So, you know, everything has a tipping point, and I think that tipping point is coming very soon. And, you know, that's what I think.
No, that makes sense. No, I agree with you. It's the funny thing about black swan events is you don't know what they are. That's why they're black swans, but
exactly
you can feel the odds of it going up over time, and it feels like that right now. Hey, Avi, last question for you. With the ethical AI database, like, what's your vision for it this year? Where do you hope to get to in the year ahead yourself?
Yeah, good question. I think it's still an evolving project, but I think what I want to do more of in the last couple of years, I've been consulting with a lot of with governments to sort of profile the companies in their jurisdiction and, you know, make sure that they're aware of who's actively doing work in this space. I'd like to continue doing that, and, you know, spreading out to more developing nations is a part of the project. I want to get more involved in sort of African initiatives that are coming out. Australian initiatives, you know, South Asian initiatives, things like that. There's a lot of developing markets, and I think that, you know, if we enable safer AI systems like that as they're scaling up, I think that's going to have a very dramatic effect later down the road. And so that's ideally what I'd like to do. I think it's a hard task because you know, while you're scaling on AI is all you can think about. And, you know, the whole build fast, break things mentality, that's what we're trying to change, right? So, yeah, I think that's what's in store. And of course, we're going to keep releasing reports, tracking more companies, updates, all that stuff. So stay tuned.
All right. No, thank you so much. And yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, that type of inclusiveness and particularly the material impact it can have on those countries is ginormous. So can see exactly why you'd be focused there. But Avi, really appreciate you coming on today and enjoy the discussion. All the best in building out the ethical AI database in the year ahead here.
Yeah, thanks. You too. Should be a good one for us.
All right. Thank you.